I am Mahes, son of Nephrib of Memphis. People now just call me grandfather, and think my stories are the rambling of an old man who has seen too many sons. Perhaps they are right. But the Nile has not carried away everything I remember. Let me take you back slowly, the way old men do, because the young always hurry and miss the truth. I was 25 when the Roman ships first appeared on the horizon, like black beetles against the dawn. We were moored at the great harbor, repairing oars after a storm. The air smelled of tar, fish, and wet papyrus. Someone shouted that the flagship flew the red cloak of a Roman imperator. We laughed at first. Romans had come before, always to collect money, never to stay. This time they stayed. The city had already split into two hearts. One heart beat for Cleopatra. She had fled to the east with her mercenaries and her golden barge. The other heart beat for the little king in the palace, only 12 years old, surrounded by men who spoke for him. And then there was the princess no one spoke of loudly, Arsinoe IV. She lived in the women's quarter, studied with Greek tutors, practiced speaking 9 languages the way other girls practiced the harp. We, common soldiers, barely knew her face. But the gods knew. One night, I remember it was the night of the new moon, when the jackals howl loudest, something happened in the palace. Whispers ran through the barracks. The princess and her eunuch Ganymedes had vanished. By morning, the whole Egyptian army stood on the eastern causeway, and she stood before us. She did not come on a chariot or in a golden litter. She came walking barefoot, in a plain white calasiris that the wind pressed against her legs. Her hair was loose, black as wet obsidian, and the double crown of Egypt, red and white together, was tied only with a leather cord, not yet placed on her head. She looked too young to carry what she was about to carry. She climbed onto an upturned fishing boat, so we could all see her. The sun was just rising behind the lighthouse. Its beams swept across her face like a blessing from Pharos itself. Then she spoke, and her voice was not loud, but it carried the way a thrown spear carries. My father owed Rome gold. Rome has come for more than gold. They want our souls. I will not give them mine. Will you give them yours? Silence. Then 20,000 spears struck shields at once. The sound rolled across the water like thunder. That was the moment Egypt chose her. We thought the war would be short. We were wrong. For the first month we owned the streets. We knew every alley, every rooftop. We poured seawater into the Roman aqueduct. You could hear the legionaries screaming when they tasted salt in their cups. We dragged fishing nets across narrow lanes and waited for patrols to tangle. When they came, boys no older than 15 dropped millstones from the windows. The Romans learned to fear shadows. I was in the party that set fire to the ships in the harbor. Caesar himself stood on the mole, cloak blazing, shouting orders no one could hear over the roar of flames. He jumped into the water and swam, one hand holding his purple cloak above the waves so it would not be lost. We laughed about that for weeks. The great Caesar swimming like a kitchen boy who dropped the soup. Arsinoe walked the walls every evening. She never wore armor, only the linen dress and a short sword at her hip. She would stop, lean over the battlements, and ask the sentries their names, where their villages were. One night she found me sitting with my blistered hands wrapped in bloody cloth. "Mahes of Memphis," she said, remembering my name though I had told her only once. "When this is over, what will you do?" "Build boats again," I answered. "Honest boats that carry grain, not soldiers." She smiled then. The only time I ever saw her smile without sadness in it. "Then build me one with hawk wings on the sail," she said, "so I can fly home if the gods ever let me." We almost had him. Caesar's men were down to eating their own belt leather. Reinforcements were still months away. Then Ganymedes began acting like a king himself, executing officers who questioned him. The native Egyptian commanders hated taking orders from a eunuch. And Caesar, clever fox, released the boy Ptolemy 13 into our camp, dressed in full pharaoh's regalia. Suddenly half the army remembered they wanted a male king, not a girl who fought better than they did. That was the crack through which everything broke. The last battle was not on solid ground. It was fought in the reedy swamps where the Nile spreads its fingers. The mud sucked at our ankles, then our knees, then our waists. Roman javelins came in flat arcs that never missed. I saw the boy king's barge overturn. The golden scale armor glittered once, then sank. We fought until the water around us turned pink, then red, then black under the moon. When they brought Arsinoe out of the reeds, her white dress was torn, and she had lost one sandal. A centurion tied her hands with his own scarf, silk, scarlet, still smelling of Roman perfume. She did not cry. She looked back once at the army that had abandoned her and said, loud enough for the nearest ranks to hear, "Remember this day. Remember who stood and who knelt." 2 years later I stood in Rome, chained with 100 other prisoners, watching her walk the sacred way. The golden fetters were so heavy, she had to rest every 20 steps. The crowd was strangely quiet. Roman women threw flowers. One old senator was heard to say, "We conquered Gaul with less shame than this." Caesar read the mood. Instead of strangling her at the temple of Jupiter, he sent her to Ephesus, to the great temple of Artemis, where the rite of sanctuary was older than Rome itself. She lived there in rooms of white marble, dressed as a priestess, tending the eternal flame. Pilgrims came from as far as India, and said she still had the same eyes that saw through you. I went back to Memphis. I built boats. Honest boats. But every time I carved a hawk into the prow I thought of her. Then came the year the world broke again. Caesar bled to death on the Senate floor. Mark Antony took the east. And Cleopatra, always Cleopatra, sailed to meet him in Ephesus on a barge whose oars were silver, and whose sails were purple silk. They say she walked through the temple precinct herself, past the very altar where her sister prayed, and whispered something to Antony over bowls of snow-cooled wine. 3 nights later armed men in Roman cloaks climbed the temple steps after moonset. They dragged Arsinoe from the feet of the goddess's statue. The high priestess screamed that the sanctuary was inviolate. One of the soldiers struck her silent with the flat of his sword. They killed Arsinoe on the 19th step. 19. I heard the number from a Greek merchant who saw the blood the next morning. The priests counted the steps when they washed them, and the stains stopped exactly at the 19th. The temple began to decay after that. First the roof tiles slipped. Then the great cedar beams rotted overnight. People said Artemis had turned her face away because a suppliant's blood had soaked her threshold. Cleopatra lived another 10 years. She died beautifully, they say, with an ASP at her breast like a piece of jewelry. History gave her statues, poems, whole libraries. Arsinoe got silence. But silence is never complete. Old soldiers like me told the story in the beer houses of the Delta. Children in Ephesus grew up knowing which step still held a darker vein in the marble. And centuries later, when the temple was only ruins and Rome itself was old, some loyal soul, perhaps a priestess who had loved her, perhaps a veteran who never forgot, built her a tomb no one was ordered to build. 8 sides, like a tiny lighthouse. Egyptian lotus capitals mixed with Greek acanthus. A place where the wind from the sea sounds almost like the wind across the Nile. In your year, 1929 men with German accents dug it up. They argued over the bones the way scholars always do. Too young, too old, male, female. But we who carried spears under the hawk-eyed girl do not need bones to know whose tomb it is. I never saw her crowned in gold. I saw her crowned in firelight on a city wall, with 20,000 men ready to die, because a girl of 18 asked them to live free. That is crown enough. So when you walk past the great temples and hear only Cleopatra's name echoing, remember there was another voice once. A quieter voice. A voice that asked a tired oarsman what he would do when the war was over, and listened to his answer as if it mattered. The Nile keeps its own records. Stone forgets, but water remembers. And I, Mahaze, son of Nephrib, last of the men who stood on the causeway that dawn, I tell you this so the water will not have to remember alone. She almost saved Egypt. She almost beat Caesar. She paid with 19 steps and a stain that would not wash away. That is all the history any queen needs. Now the sun is low, my grandchildren. Bring me a little water. And when you pour it on the ground for the dead, pour a little extra. Some throats, even after 2,000 years, are still dry.